I've been thinking about making this video for a while now, but thanks to a commenter, I can say that by request, I'm going to be talking about the Fontaine Archon quest. I'm going to talk about a few different things pertaining to this quest and probably make chapters in this video so you can skip to certain parts. I personally thought Fontaine was the best quest by, like, a lot, because everyone had such positive reactions towards it, and I think especially towards Furina as a character, it made me question why this quest was so good and so impactful. So to make sense of it all, I started by analyzing the structure of the story. In true screenwriter fashion, I looked to dissect it into its 8 sequences. So the 8 sequences aren't different from the 3 acts, it's just more detailed. The first sequence introduces the characters, the setting, important details, it sets the status quo of the daily lives of your characters, and it ends in sort of an inciting incident, so something that launches you into the action to begin with. You could probably guess in the Fontaine quest what this was. It was Traveler meeting Lyney and Lynette, getting introduced to the prophecy that's been floating around, the introduction of Furina, and it included literally the only important part that Charlotte had in the story, which was introducing the case of the missing girls. I think you could argue that the inciting incident was the introduction of the prophecy itself, but I'm taking it to be the case of the missing girls because that is the case that actually launched Traveler into action. Upon hearing about the prophecy, the Traveler wasn't immediately engaged in trying to solve that, which leads to the second sequence, which includes the setup in the predicament and what locks them into dealing with that predicament. Because Traveler starts to form a relationship with Lyney and Lynette right off the bat, and he's invited to see their performance, they have an emotional investment. So when Lyney does get charged, Traveler actually has a reason to come to Lyney's defense because Lyney had already helped the Traveler by keeping them from being charged for bringing Paimon around as a flying object. I don't think the first act ends until that case is actually solved, and we're introduced to the role that the Fatui are playing in Fontaine. The Traveler is finally forced to confront the prophecy. We start to realize how the missing girls case ties into the prophecy, and the stakes rise. Navia, who I think was a very important character, and a pretty well-written character too, is introduced in the first act, and through working with her to help solve the case, Traveler is given a further emotional stake in trying to actually do something about the prophecy. I'd say at the end of the trial, when it's revealed what the primordial seawater can do, and then Child is charged, is the start of the second act. The first obstacle is overcome, so yes, Lyney and Lynette were proven innocent, but a whole new problem that was sort of lurking in the background the entire time, that's actually very integrated into their initial obstacle, comes to light, and they are forced to do something about it, which is also a good reason that they brought Child into that story, because otherwise Traveler would have very little reason to go to the Fortress of Meropide, which I would say was a weaker part of the story altogether. So the 4.1 part of the quest, we are already a little ways into what I would consider Act 2. There's 2 different obstacles that I think can be considered the high obstacle that Sequence 4 sets up. I think I'm going to refer to it generally just as the primordial seawater. As the Traveler tries to learn about Child's whereabouts in the Fortress of Meropide, the threat of the seawater becomes more prevalent. I think this is probably why, for me, the Fortress of Meropide section of this kind of dragged a little bit, because it largely took place during Sequence 4, which is the setup for a much larger obstacle. Sequence 5 is often known as like the subplot sequence. It's an emotional part for a character and a certain relationship they have in the story. Initially, I interpreted the main subplot that was really going on to be between Traveler and Navia, but upon looking back at the structure, I think it was more so between Traveler, the twins, and Fremine. Despite Navia's subplot also being well developed, Fontaine introduces us to this idea of the Fatui not being a completely evil organization as they were framed in the Inazuma quest, and it complicates the knowledge that we already have about the way that Teyvat works. So I think this definitely makes sense as the significant Sequence 5 subplot that was developed. The rising action, which is also usually at the end of Sequence 5, is pretty obvious. It's that cutscene where Wriothesley and Clorinde have to stop the primordial seawater. You've probably noticed thus far that I have not mentioned Furina that much in this summary, but I definitely will because she was my favorite part of this quest, and I do not hesitate to say that I think she is one of the best written characters in this game. So after that crisis is averted, we move into Sequence 6, which is the end of Act 2. The arguably largest obstacle thus far has been quelled, and we start to get a hint at what the third act is going to be about. We have Arlecchino telling the Traveler they are not quite sure that Furina is actually a god. She seems more like a human who's been cursed. And we have Neuvillette telling us that unless Furina gives up her gnosis, he cannot actually stop the primordial seawater. And so we know from that he's going to have to get that power back, and that is how this story is going to resolve itself. And as if we weren't already wondering, we're really trying to figure out now what is with Furina, who is she, and what is she planning. So the beginning of the 4.2 quest, I would say, directly coincides with the beginning of the third act. In the 7th sequence, a new tension is usually introduced, and you also get the famous twist. The new tension is Furina's refusal to engage with anyone about the issue at hand. Additionally, to up the stakes and add to the emotional impact of the story, we have the incident at the Spina de Rosula, and some of the best NPCs we've had in this game die. As much as that saddened me to see those guys die, I think it was a great choice for the story because it really forces Navia to actually arc, which is something that's like rarely evident in these characters and stories. I think a great part about the Fontaine quest was that there wasn't just one twist, there was two, and they were anything but random. Not only do we learn that the people of Fontaine aren't actually humans, they're all oceanids, but we also, of course, learned that Furina is in fact human, and that she was part of an elaborate scheme put on by Focalors to deceive heavenly principles. I think the entire story and its structure up until these points is part of what made this ending and these twists so interesting. We were given basically every piece of information that we needed so that we could have predicted what was going to happen, yet the game was subtle enough with it that it wasn't obvious. I think this is also a creative story because Furina in the third act was the antagonist, so it is resolved in the end, and interestingly, Traveler is almost the one that hindered it from being resolved, not the one who actually saved the nation despite driving the plot forward. Generally, the characters in Genshin don't have to be all that fleshed out for people to like them. Navia, I think, is a very important character. I think they did a great job with her. I personally didn't feel too strongly about Navia, but I understand why people did. She's a character that's very devoted towards maintaining justice. She has two of the coolest bodyguards ever, and the music they use to introduce her is incredible. Like I said in the story analysis too, she actually has a pretty clear arc. She has a very obvious emotional investment that keeps her connected with the story in a very natural way. I'll talk about Wriothesley too. He kind of felt random. There wasn't much to him as a character. I didn't dislike him. I actually found his character pretty amusing. He was just really chill and talked about Tila, which was kind of funny, and he did actually move the plot forward in his own way. I thought the Noah's Ark thing was kind of goofy, and this game does do a lot of goofy stuff. He definitely had a personality and he definitely did stuff for the plot, but he wasn't super well developed as a character. Other characters in the fortress, however, were almost entirely useless. I realized that Sigewinne actually had a part in the Fortress of Meropide arc of the story, but basically her entire role in it felt like it could have been cut out. Her role probably could have been condensed into other characters' roles. There was only one other character that I was equally kind of done with, and that was Charlotte. Charlotte, like I said, had one important part. She introduced the case of the missing girls. Most every other part she played felt like it could have also been condensed into another character's role. At the end, how she was sort of just interviewing everyone felt very pointless. No Charlotte hate. I just didn't like her role in the story. Apparently, I love characters who have sacrificed a lot to save people, so you probably won't be surprised to hear that I found Focalors to be an amazing character. I think it's impressive that despite only being introduced to her in the last 20 to 30 minutes of the story, it still felt like we already knew her. I know a lot of people seem to be kind of confused about the identity of her and Furina and who's who. I thought it made pretty decent sense. She was the divinity part of who she was, and Furina was the human part of who she was. In a way, they are just two elements of the same individual, so I think that probably added to the ease of introducing this very important character so late. Next, we'll talk about Neuvillette. Neuvillette's arc is not quite as obvious and doesn't take place over the Fontaine quest quest itself, but it is explained to us his place and why he was set up as a pawn by Focalors. We've seen him care about the people of Fontaine for a while, even if not very obviously, being this character that's been more or less running the show and almost acting like the nation's actual leader the entire time. Neuvillette's story of starting off very removed from humanity and not a big fan of the Archons themselves, and actually obtaining all of his power back, working with an Archon for the sake of saving humans, framed him as a very admirable character that people can like. Anyways, now we're gonna talk about Furina. I know there were people that didn't like her at the beginning, which personally I find a little strange. Not because disliking a stuck-up and snotty brat is strange, but because I think it was obvious from the beginning that that's not actually how she was. And maybe that's not a fair take, because the entire purpose of her personality was to trick people, which she did do successfully for 500 years, but we're not going into the quest with the mindset of an NPC from Fontaine. But enough of that. Her introduction scene, from the music to her bravado, was all very entertaining, and I was very curious as to who she really was and why is she like this. I think in the case of Furina, if we're going to talk about whether she arced or not, I'm not sure whether to say yes or no. We didn't see a clear arc, not because she was underdeveloped, but because the story was actively twisting itself in a way that's very uncommon, yet was done so effectively. In a way, you could frame her prevailing as overcoming what is perceived as human limitations, but because Furina was written in a slightly unconventional way, I think that leaves this open to interpretation. If her own flaws of being human and not an Archon had held her back and someone had caught suspicion, like Focalors said, it would have been all over. She played her role flawlessly. So despite playing her role flawlessly, did she actually not have flaws or a challenge, a personal challenge to overcome? We didn't see much of it, which is why I think her story quest might be more interesting. Overall, I was very impressed with it. I didn't expect to be so emotionally invested in a quest from Genshin. I think what set this apart for me was that the sad backstories weren't just things that were mentioned, but they were actively things that seemed to drive them in ways that were very integrated to the story as a whole. I don't recall this being as strong in other parts of the story, and yeah, there were things that were kind of goofy about this story and I think could have been done better or didn't work well, but they weren't things that I felt made the story less effective as a whole. Anyways, if you made it this far, check out some of my other videos. You might like them. I reacted to Furina's demo. Admittedly, that video I think could have been better in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of people also liked that video, so maybe you will too. Anyways, thanks for stopping by, and I would love to hear what you guys thought about the Archon quest.